Okay, we are going to close our conference that has been, I think, very successful, both for the huge number of papers that have been presented and also for their quality. So now we have our final lecture, which this year will be held by Professor Rochon. It is a great pleasure to me to introduce him. He is full professor of economics at Laurentian University, editor-in-chief of the Review of Political Economy, associate editor of the Journal of Business and Economic Studies. He is the author of a huge number of papers, more than 150 in both peer review journals and in several books. And he has written or edited, I think, close, but perhaps now also more than 40 books. He is also the editor of two book series, The New Direction in Post-Keynesian Economics, published by Elgar, and the Elgar series on central banking and monetary policy. And he is also the co-director of the Monetary Policy Institute, which includes the widely cited blog, the @Monetary blog. And so now the floor to Professor Rochon. His final lecture is entitled Which Rate of Interest for Full Employment, PK, that is Post-Keynesian Reply to the Taylor Rule.
Thank you very much. First, I want to thank the organizers of this conference and Sergio in particular for inviting me. I just sent an email last night to Marc Lavoie and Mario Sequereccia saying how absolutely envious I am of people in Rome and elsewhere in Italy. You have such a huge number of scholars, and you're able to do, these wonderful get-togethers. In Canada, I think we're 3.5 post-Keynesians. That's about it. I won't tell you who the half is, but no. Okay, so I was asked to give a talk on which rate of interest for full employment. This is a self-portrait. You can see the resemblance. And I am going to divide the talk into two. First, in dealing with monetary policy, I think it's important to demolish the mainstream view first, to lay it bare, to see how naked the emperor is, and then to rebuild it from a post-Keynesian perspective. And I'll get into some ideas about where I'm heading. And I'm going to end the paper on a somewhat sour note to say that I am completely confused, that my views on monetary policy have changed a lot in the last 5 years, and in particular in the last year and a half. I think the resurgence of inflation has raised a lot of questions for me on how to deal with it, or should we deal with it. Those who were in Toronto, you sort of saw this debate, and I've been having this debate with Marc and Mario for the year and a half on a weekly basis on, these difficult questions. And again, last night, an hour's worth of exchanging emails. So you're going to see where I probably have now more questions about monetary policy, not the theory, endogenous money, exogenous interest rates, monetary policy implementation. Those are technical issues, and there's fine. But it's the policy area that I think this inflation has raised. And don't forget, we didn't have much inflation to talk about for 4 decades. It was relatively tame, and it was not a big deal. And post-Keynesians didn't talk much about inflation. But in the last year and a half, it has surged back. It's down now again. And it's raised a lot of questions as to interest rates. What should central banks do about inflation and with interest rates? And there, I think I got Marc, Mario, and I have disagreements about this now, and we're trying to solve these disagreements. Last night, we agreed to do another workshop on the mandate of central banks to try to resolve some of these questions. So first of all, I want to say that I am an unrepentant Keynesian, and I think it's very important to begin the talk with a picture of Keynes, my dog, of course, John Maynard Canines, but friends call him Maynard, of course. I want to do a few slides on a few plugs. The review of political economy. I've published many of you in Rope. Antonino has a paper coming out. It's published online. It's coming out soon. And you guys, and you got a paper coming soon. Where's your co-author? He's not here. And but yeah, that's right. Oh, no. And so we got a symposium on conflict inflation coming with a paper. That's where your paper is, and our paper, and Bob Rowthorne has a paper, La Voix. And we also have a symposium on monetary policy and income distribution coming. So we got quite a few interesting symposiums. So if you have a paper that you're interested in sending to me, please do so. And the Monetary Policy Institute, if you want to submit a blog, I'd be very happy. This is the book series we created with Silvio Capes in Brazil, Guillaume Venet in France, and it's about pushing the envelope on monetary policy. And, you know, the more, and of course, as editor of these books, I've read the articles, and they raise more questions, you know, so the more you study something, the more I get confused anyways. The next book coming out soon is the one on gender. It's the first book ever on monetary policy and gender, so very happy about it. And I apologize, we are 3 men publishing a book on gender. And these are some of the books that have come out recently. The Encyclopedia of Post-Keynesian Economics, you have an entry in it. I'm not sure who else in here. And we got a few books coming out. Money in Production, which is, we are simply republishing, I think, 15 or 18 of the articles from the French series Monnaie Production that was edited by Alain Parguez, who died a couple of years ago. And we have one that I'm editing with Guglielmo Davanzati and Stefano Lucarelli on monetary circuit. And this one, Basil Moore's 1988 book, that was getting reprinted, republished by Routledge with an introduction by Marc Lavoie and myself. Okay, I think that's it for the shameful. Oh, yeah. The Monetary Blog is having a debate or a discussion with Joe Stiglitz, Claudia Sam on February 8th. I can send you the link if you email me. It promises to be a very interesting debate. Okay. So, I'm going to go over here. So the question, which interest rate for full employment, is a difficult question to answer. Post-Keynesians generally reject the idea that there is an equilibrium interest rate that corresponds to full employment, or that full employment can occur at any interest rate, depending, of course, on fiscal policy and et cetera. So it is a very difficult question to answer. And we know unemployment is related to aggregate demand, but how is it related to interest rates? And if you're a mainstream economist, the answer is quite easy. The natural rate of interest, period, gives you some sort of full employment, NERU, whatever that is, but it gives you an answer. But I think that in the real world, you have to understand the proper transmission mechanism of monetary policy to answer that question. And yeah, so it can happen at any interest rate, which is going to be the conclusion of this talk. Like I said, for the mainstream, the central bank has to simply set the nominal short-term rate, the policy rate, the benchmark rate equal to the natural rate. And as we know, and as I'll say, I'll remind you in a few minutes, there's no natural rate. It's easy to define, but impossible to measure. And I've had this conversation with people at the Bank of Canada, and they say, yes, of course, it's difficult to measure, but we know it exists because if there's inflation, that's proof that the nominal rate is below the natural rate. So therefore, we have to raise it. And if prices go down, we've overshoot. So, and the transmission mechanism is embodied in the well-known new consensus model. And this is sort of a very, simple model. You can get more complicated Hank models, but they all come down to the same type of relationships between these variables. And you have a Phillips curve type variable in the first equation. The second equation, of course, is your familiar Phillips curve. And your third equation is a closed economy, but some sort of Taylor rule. And when I first came across the Taylor rule, I did my PhD in 93 to 98, and Taylor's paper came out in 93. And I remember having had conversations with Mark about the Taylor paper at the time. I think it was Mark. And so I was aware of the existence of Taylor, thought it was interesting. And I remember Ben, no relation, and Friedman of Harvard. And I remember exchanging with him because he had papers on this. And I thought it was a very interesting and promising sort of area of research for New Keynesians who were sort of arguing in terms of endogenous money, or was it endogenous money? But I was always very sort of interested in that. And very earlier on, I thought it was a very sort of a fun model because it got close to what post-Keynesians were arguing. And in fact, Basil Moore told me that John Taylor was a student of his, and that John Taylor got the idea for the Taylor rule from Basil Moore. Now, I could never prove that. I found evidence. John Taylor. But that's the story that Basil was telling me at the time. If you read Basil's 1988 book, I think it is, in fact, very close to, certainly as an activist rule, it's very close to what, Taylor was arguing at the time. And so anyway, so this is the first model, a New Keynesian model. And but there's a lot of problems from post-Keynesian perspective, let alone these five. And these all have to do with the effectiveness of monetary policy. And so from a mainstream perspective, the argument is quite simple. If there's inflation above target, you raise your interest rate, and that filters through your IS curve, your Phillips curve, and finally brings inflation back down to target, hopefully creating a soft landing in the process. So that's what the story is. However, this is a paper I've written called The General Ineffectiveness of Monetary Policy. And for reasons I'm going to give, I don't think that monetary policy is very effective at all from a mainstream perspective. And so that begs the question, what then, right? So when I was at the New School and I took a class with John Eatwell, John Eatwell always said the first thing what Keynes failed to do was to demolish neoclassical economics, which is what Straffa did. So John was always saying, first thing you must do is prove what's wrong with the existing theory before you can even propose something more positive. Okay. So this is what I'm doing. I'm not going to go through all of that, but certainly this is and this is part of a book I'm writing right now, actually. And in the book, I've been accumulating all these quotes the past 20 years, and I'm just through a couple there. And I got some papers that have estimates and all of that. But, I think the IS curve is something that we can agree on. It is not a very, because monetary policy or the new consensus models, you must have an elastic IS curve because you have to have your interest rate impact output, right? So if your IS curve or if your aggregate demand is insensitive to interest rates, then you're not going to have those degrees of freedom of those, So monetary policy requires an elastic IS curve. And there you go. The Sharpin Suarez quote is from the Federal Reserve. The second quote is from the ECB. So these are, why quote these silly heterodox people when you can quote authoritative people from the ECB? And, so they're saying, that these, and Krugman has come out and said the same thing, and Stiglitz has said the same thing, that investment and consumption are insensitive. And of course, is Stephen Frazzari and all those people. And I think most people here would agree that, interest rates. And so my view on that is, and I see a lot of post-Keynesians with interest rates in their investment functions, et cetera. And it bothers me because I don't think the relationship is that linear. I think you have to differentiate between incremental changes in interest rates and the cumulative increases in interest rates. So I think that what investment and aggregate demand is insensitive to are these incremental changes. But after a while, after 11, 12, 13 times, then they're bound to have an impact. So I don't know how to model that, but I think that from a heterodox perspective, we just can't put an interest rate. We really have to sort of differentiate and look at incremental versus cumulative effects. The Phillips curve, I'm not going to get into it. We sort of know that it has flattened. Some people have, Fred Mishkin wrote a paper recently, he said, no. Phillips curve is not dead, it was hibernating. And post-pandemic, it has resurged. And quite a lot of papers now show that the post-pandemic Phillips curve is rather quite steep. And the problem I have with that, first of all, is you don't have that many post-pandemic. Even if you use quarterly data, you have, 8 observations, 10 observations? So probably not enough to reach that conclusion. The Phil Orestes and Malcolm quote, I think, is quite nice. And it reminds me of the quote by Keynes of, Keynes says there's a slip of the cup. What's that quote by Keynes? There's more than one sip between the cup and the lips. So the first two sort of mechanisms of transmission of monetary policy sort of fall through. And that's why I'm arguing, and by the way, if you don't have a Phillips curve to speak of, a well-defined, well-behaved Phillips curve, you have no monetary policy from a mainstream perspective. It is sort of the bedrock of monetary policy. You need to raise that interest rate in order to lower output, raise unemployment to affect inflation. Now, I think that I was talking about this yesterday, some central banks may be targeting exchange rates more than anything else. But I think that this is certainly the speech that they give, and maybe that's the one they want because they don't want to admit about exchange rate targeting. But nevertheless, then that opens up another sort of series of questions, right? The natural rate of interest, this is what I said at the beginning. You can't calculate it, so, you can't even, how do you, and, when neoclassical economics is a model of convergence and stability, and your natural rate of interest is your point of convergence. And it's, the idea is that the real rate or the policy rate converges to the natural rate. So if you don't have that center of gravitation, pardon the pun, then you have a problem. And this is about the inflation target itself. I wrote a blog back in June 2022 where I argued that the 2% target was an invented number. And I've got a piece coming out next week in The Guardian about this, sort of an expanded version of that paper. And I argue the same thing. I've got, these are quotes from the governor of the Bank of New Zealand. And Ben Friedman, this is a great quote by Ben, where he calls it a professional embarrassment, that there's no empirical work that justifies a 2% target. And Stiglitz has recently said it was just invented, pulled out of thin air, the argument. And that's important because, first of all, I don't believe in an inflation target. I think it undermines the creation of output, the creation of jobs in an important way. But I think that, if you do have a target, what it is important, because if the target was 4%, which is still a relatively low and stable number, we'd be having a very different conversation today. And interest rates would have started coming down quite a while back. So not only is it, you have to be able to justify why 2%. Something I read was that apparently, because New Zealand is where the first central bank that inflation targeting in 1990. And what I read is apparently the government said that they would have liked to have 0% as a target. And then the central bank said, well, the inflation bias for New Zealand is about 1.7%. So we'll just round it up to 2%. And that apparently is where the 2% target comes from. But again, not very scientific. The Council on Foreign Relations in the United States calls it a somewhat accidental number, and that's very true. And so, and I'm surprised because, inflation targeting is the most important economic policy in a country, because fiscal policy is secondary. And so the main show is monetary policy grounded in an inflation target that sort of was invented to a large degree. Okay. I'm not sure why I go back to the Phillips curve here, but the argument, and one of the things I have about the Phillips curve is that it's not only a story about correlation between unemployment and inflation. If it was a question of correlation, I'd be a lot more open to it. But there is an embedded causality involved in the theory of the Phillips curve. That is, that higher unemployment forces down inflation. And that's because the story of inflation is essentially a demand story about inflation in the Phillips curve. Some people have done cost pushes and shocks in the Phillips curve, but the curve itself is about demand inflation. And so for me, I've got a problem with the story about demand inflation, not that I think it's negligible, but I think it is a small component of overall inflation. And a causal story of demand inflation for me is problematic, especially if you fight inflation on the backs of workers. So there's not only a story of demand inflation, but it's a story with embedded social classes involved in social conflict, and it's And this is the Mishkin quote. And just yesterday, Paul Krugman wrote in the Times, well, we seem to be back to the pre-pandemic Phillips curve, which is flat. And whether it was steep or not during maybe 1 year, but at least he's saying we're back to the normal flat Phillips curve for now. But I think that what the problem with the steepened Phillips curve is that they were incorporating into this supply shocks. Prices went up because of oil or other commodities or transportation costs or bottlenecks, and they were incorporating that into inflation. So the steepened Phillips curve included demand and cost-related inflation numbers. And so that's how they generated. And I've seen some studies where they say if you take the cost components out, yeah, it comes right back down to flat. And I have something, I hope I put it there. Yeah, so this is the paper by Serrato and Gitti in particular. They argue that in post-pandemic, demand accounted for about 25% of total inflation, but that in normal times, it's negligible. So even during the worst of the pandemic, total inflation, demand was only 25% of inflation, and the rest is supply, rooted in supply shocks. And then you have a monetary policy based on, fighting demand inflation. So these increases, these 11 increases in interest rates, essentially was meant to bring down 25% of overall inflation. So it seems to be fitting to call it austerity policy, monetary austerity. And, I remember a comment made by Jamie Galbraith, and his argument was demand is a small component of overall inflation. Those increases are meant to bring down demand, to crush demand so much that the decline in demand inflation overcompensates for the increase in supply inflation. So I think maybe that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, this is the quote. According to our estimates, demand factors explain about 1/4 of the post-COVID increase in CPI inflation. And before COVID, it was small and statistically insignificant. And, this is a very mainstream paper that's been cited a lot. So it was refreshing to read. And this is, I put this on social media, on Twitter, and I was attacked by a lot of people on it. And, these are just correlate inflation and unemployment. There you go. And people attacked me for using a scatter plot diagram, saying it's not serious at all. I go, I've read a lot of IMF and BIS and Federal Reserve papers that use scatter plot diagrams. And what it shows is that people who believe, like I said, if you don't have a Phillips curve, what does monetary policy do? So if the Phillips curve has a flat component, then you got to exploit that flat component to the degree where finally maybe, but monetary policy becomes ineffective or impotent. And so if you believe in monetary policy and its role, then you reject this type of thing because, you hang on to the Phillips curve as much as you can. And what my neighbor in Toronto once told me, he's a banker, trained at Oxford, and his argument was, an economist, And his argument was, well, you just have to assume the Phillips curve exists. And it reminds me of that joke of a chemist and a physicist and an economist with a can of beans. You just assume the existence of a can opener. And I just said, but you can't do, well, the Phillips curve is there. And you see a lot of attempts now to try to find the proper specification of the Phillips curve. Oh, it's done through this, or well, if you include that, then you can see this sort of, so anyways, then you get so much away from the Phillips curve that it's no longer relevant. And, I'm ready to admit that interest rates affect housing markets, and that might have, some sort of, but again, and then you have to, even if you include a housing market, you have to explain that you raise interest rates, you collapse the housing market, you raise unemployment, and that raise unemployment collapses wages to the point where inflation comes down. And that for me is a story that is difficult to, yeah. Anyways, that raises a number of other questions. Okay. So, like I said, in chapter 7 of my book from 1999, the last chapter was about new consensus models. I think I was the first one to write about them because I had discovered them, and I had, discovered some of the early literature on these, and I wrote about them. And I think that the title is Some Interesting Passages in New Keynesian Literature. And they were talking about the ability of the central bank to set the rate of interest, and that money somehow adapts. And so there were some very interesting things in there. And so I was very much interested in this literature. And for a while, I was interested in perhaps forging a conversation with the mainstream. I thought this was an opportunity for dialogue. And I quickly realized that, they're not interested. And at the end of the day, they might have some similar instruments, but they are far, far, far away from a post-Keynesian perspective. But I was interested in this Taylor rule, the idea that central banks no longer control the money supply like in Friedman, but it was the interest rate, and they had a target, output gap, and it was interesting for me. And so that led me into exploring an alternative to the Taylor rule, because I didn't think post-Keynesians, they argued in terms of endogenous money, exogenous interest rates, but I don't think they had a specific target in mind when they set the interest rate. Basil's book in 1988 came somewhat close, where he had, inflation target or output or unemployment as targets. I presented the first version of my paper with Setterfield in Dijon in 2005 about interest rate rules. And Tom Pally sort of accused me of being a monetarist because I had interest rate rules versus discretion. And I had to explain to him that it was not money rules and it was interest rate rules. But so I continued with Mark, and Mark thought the idea was interesting because it was a good way of introducing interest rate in some sort of Kaleckian models of growth. And so we did those papers. And what I did is I sort of noticed that, and at the time I thought all post-Keynesians were kind of alike, that we were all arguing in terms of fine-tuning, increasing interest rates or decrease. And then I realized that there were sort of two camps in post-Keynesians, the activist, what we call the activist camp, and what we then called the parking it camp. And Lavoie thought it was and the parking, it was the Smithian rule, the Pazinetti rule, and the Kansas City rule. And Lavoie thought they were great. Oh, well. I'll get to that quote later. So and then I started the idea of rejecting fine tuning. So for me, fine tuning was something, because I was aware that interest rates didn't affect investment as much as we thought. So I started thinking, why increase interest rates? Why do that? And so I remember coming across this quote by John Robinson. The regulating effect of changes in the rate of interest was at best very weak. And I came across that quote after my dissertation, because it's not in my book. And she calls a fine tuning a false scent. And we must reject the conception of an economy which is automatically held on a path of steady development by the mechanism of the rate of interest. So, I thought this was kind of very interesting. And by then I had not sort of read anything about the rejection of fine tuning. So that was for me a very interesting quote. And then this quote by Marc Lavoie. Now, Marc is my mentor. I've known him for almost 40 years, undergraduate professor, and he was on my committee, PhD committee. And this is in a book by Edward Nell called Money in Motion. And here he says, it becomes clear that monetary policy should not be so much to control the level of activity, but to find the level of interest rates that will be proper for the economy from a distribution point of view. And so that quote alone, for me, opened up a whole new area of research. That's when I started connecting. And this was, I think, before Marc wrote about the Pazinetti rule, or index, because I think that came from 1999 with a paper by Sicareccia. But I was still a student at the New School. I was there between 93 and 98. And so that was for me, a very important quote. And that led me down a path of looking at the relationship between monetary policy and income distribution, and less so the impact of interest rates on output or unemployment. And so I wrote these three papers. Lavoie calls the activist rule the countercyclical rule, and the parking it rule the distributive rule, and I think those are better words. But those rules, that literature, those papers with Setterfield were written at a time when inflation was not a problem. And in the last year and a half with inflation, it has raised a lot of questions in my mind because, if we follow Pazinetti rule, which is essentially if you follow it would mean that interest rates would have had to gone up pretty high with inflation. And so, the Pazinetti rule is that the real rate of interest should be equal to labor productivity growth plus inflation. And when inflation was up to 10% in the United States, then you had, problem. In my head, you had a problem. And that's when it started having discussions with Marc and Mario. And then, there's a few questions involved. Is the Pazinetti rule about a long-term rate of interest on bonds, which is how Pazinetti and Marc and Mario, but for me, it's more about the policy rule, the central bank rule. So there's a little discrepancy there. And should we use it as, in a sort of a little bit of a counter-cyclical way or keep it fixed? So I think Mario Sicareccia believes that we should vary the policy rate I don't think we should, but there's some discrepancies between us now, and I think that it's because of inflation. It raised a lot of questions about what do we do about inflation and what do we do with interest rates. The original idea of parking it was to keep the nominal interest rate fixed. You park it and you don't move it. And then, you use fiscal policy to address problems of, I'll get to those problems. But now we have inflation and, it sort of, you're poking the bear. And so we have to, and so we're working at trying to find a way of, but we have these exchanges and they're tense at times. And but I think it's important that we try to find common grounds between the three of us. And so this is taken from, so this is the transmission mechanism, the way we see it. And this was taken by a paper that I published with Mario Secareccia, where we talk about, you've seen this graph. And so you have sort of the direct channel. This would be the impact. So if you see the interest rate not as a cost, but also as a revenue on certain assets, then as the interest rate goes up, it sort of affects the distribution between these asset holders and non-asset holders or workers, for example. And this is what John Smith had called the revenge of the rentiers, of course. And in this case, the rate of interest is an income distributive variable, very much as in the quote by Mach in 1996. The indirect channel, this is sort of the rate of interest impacts. Oh, yes, and this is about the functional distribution of income. Post-Keynesians are foremost interested in the functional distribution of income, less so in the personal distribution of income. And when we were in Bari at the conference at the central bank, not Bari, but Naples, just a quick story, I was part of the organizers, and the deal was we were going to have half heterodox and half mainstream people at the conference. And the mainstream people, they're there and they're talking about monetary policy and personal income distribution and stuff like that. And here comes the heterodox people, and we're talking about social conflict and functional distribution of income and gender and race. And they had no idea what we were talking about. And Andrea got up and he says, we would, and he says I would never allow this kind of research being done at the Bank of Italy. So it's okay to talk about personal income distribution, but not functional, because that brings up issues of social classes, social conflict, of course. But this would be sort of your traditional IS curve relationship transmission mechanism, which I don't particularly put a lot of faith in. And then, of course, you have changes in interest rate can lead to a wealth effect. And this is about asset bubbles and the wealth that it creates. And, of course, the quantitative easing, which had tremendously huge wealth effects. And I think the interest, if you read the early papers on monetary policy and income distribution from central banks and et cetera, which started to emerge around 2010, 2011, it was clear that this is what started the whole discussion for them about this income distributive effects of monetary policy. And, just for a little FYI, this is all good for them. They recognize it, but they also recognize that, of course, the long run money is neutral and that these impacts are short term. They disappear in the long run. So therefore, the central bank can completely ignore them since these are just transitory effects. Whereas post-Keynesians would argue that there are structural effects and long-term effects. So like I said, so the Positivity rule is something that we've just had a workshop in Toronto, and I think it had everyone was Italian, I think, pretty much. And but we had a really good discussion, and you could have seen you started to see the debates between Marc and Mario and I emerge during the workshop. And so, what is the Pazzanetti rule? And I think that we agree that the central bank has to have sort of a longer term view on interest rates. I think we agree on that. But I still see that as somehow, because even if you admit that the Pazzanetti rule is about the long-term rate of interest, it leaves open the question, okay, so then we haven't answered the question of the policy rate. I see that as being a policy rate anyways. But it's tied to a bigger question. What should central banks do? Certainly, should it have a double mandate, inflation and unemployment? Mario Sekec, and I think Marc agrees that it should have a dual mandate. And I'm not completely opposed to it, but if you sort of reject the effectiveness or the transmission mechanism of monetary policy, then a dual mandate makes less sense. But anyways, I would be okay with that. Income distribution. It has clear impacts on it. Should central banks be preoccupied about income distribution? I think that we have to recognize that monetary policy has income distributive effects, but should central banks target income distribution? Green policy. If central banks have green or ecological impacts, should they target some sort of green variable? QE for the people, okay, which is very popular amongst certain post-Keynesians. And in my opinion, I think we're getting to the point now that we're asking central banks to do too much. Central banks just can't do everything. I think we have to recognize that their policies have implications and consequences, real consequences, distributive consequences, and explain these to them. I mean, if you, I'll get to that in a second, but you have to recognize that they might have, but they not have to deal with them. I think that these issues really should be dealt with by fiscal policy. Fiscal policy can do a better job of regulating inflation, of regulating income distribution, output, poverty, green policies, QE for the people. What the hell is QE for the people? That's fiscal policy. So now we're asking central banks to do fiscal policy. And I think that central banks were created in order to ensure the financial stability of the banking system, maybe to help government finances, to help government finances during periods of wars. This was essentially why central banks were created. And now we've asked them to do way too much. This preoccupation, what Tobin called inflation euphoria, is a modern thing, is a more contemporary thing. I don't think central banks should be preoccupied with inflation because I don't think it's a monetary phenomenon. So why are we asking a monetary institution to deal with it? So I think we should let central banks set the rate of interest at a low level, in the sense that setting it at a low level is sort of a dual mandate. You're saying, we're being accommodative and we're being, attentive to unemployment issues or employment issues. And then let fiscal policy, and go back to a period of fiscal policy dominance. Okay? But I'm not saying that monetary policy does not have any impact. It does. But look at what's happening in the United States. 11 increases in interest rates. I'm not going to talk about inflation. The coming down of inflation had nothing to do with monetary policy. I think we agree here. But it does not have had an impact on output or employment. And I think this is the difference between incremental versus cumulative. I think incrementally it went up 11 times. Cumulatively, perhaps not enough to affect output. And, if investment depends on expectations of the growth of aggregate demand, maybe that bubble has not been burst yet. And maybe it took 13 increases in the rate of interest after the financial crisis in the United States to finally collapse that economy. So maybe 11 times, maybe we need, But monetary policy does have a tremendous impact. And I think that impact is felt through household debt loads. So, for example, sorry. So this is, before I get to that, this is the Passanetti rule versus, in orange is the federal funds rate, what it actually was. And this is sort of what the blue is the Passanetti rule, what the Passanetti rule would have been. And you can notice that from, let's say, 1987 or so, it's been relatively constant. It's sort of oscillated around 3%. And, for me, the parking it would have been to leave the policy rate stable, fixed at 3%. But notice the Passanetti rule started to, this of course is what happened. This was unusual, but with inflation, the Passanetti rule would have led to, very high policy interest rates. And so for me, that's where the question started to ring, and I don't have the answer yet. Okay, and that's why possible answer is just to have the Passanetti rule fixed at some sort, and you can shift that over a long period of time. If there are structural changes in the economy, you can adapt that. You can lower or raise that, fixed interest rate, nominal rate. I don't know. And then this is the Passanetti index, which measures, the transfer of income from the workers to bondholders. You can see that starting in 1980, right, so the so-called beginning of the neoliberal era, you've had this tremendous, and this is what John Smith and precisely called the revenge of the rentier, a tremendous, and you see that until the financial crisis, monetary policy acted as an incomes policy. And then after that, it gets a little bit more convoluted, so to speak. But of course, you had the 2011 recession and you had the COVID, and so these are outlying. But yeah, so you have to recognize that there are impact in terms of income distribution. But also, I had a discussion with someone that said, "Oh, look, United States, soft landing, we won. We proved that interest rates can be used with no effect on output or no effect on unemployment." Well, that's not exactly true in the sense that it works through personal debt and especially mortgage debt, and probably not so much in the United States. The United States, 2% of their overall mortgages are adjustable rates. So 98% of homeowners, when they buy a house, I lived in the United States, I bought a house in 2000, I paid 4.5% for my interest rate, and that would have been my interest rate for 30 years. So if increased interest rates go up and mortgage rates go up, 98% of the Americans are not affected by that. In Canada, however, 54% of our mortgages, more than half of our mortgages are variable rates. So you buy a house, you get a mortgage, and you have to renegotiate it every 3 years or every 5 years. So if interest rates go up, your mortgage rates go up. And so what happened now is in June, 52% of all mortgages in Canada are going to be renegotiated. And that means 3 to 5 years ago, people got mortgages of 2%. Now they're renegotiating them for 8%. And that's 52%. There've already been about 10% or 15% of mortgages have been renegotiated. And so by June, almost 70% of all mortgages would have been renegotiated at higher rates. I have friends of mine who now pay $2,000 more a month. And so imagine 70% and you have the same story in Finland and these countries. And I've looked at some of the real estate and mortgage refinancing conditions, and they have the same problem. And so in the United States, if increases in interest rates haven't, so that means in Canada, you have a huge aggregate demand decline, huge decline. And if you look at the United States, and they have a growth rate of about 5% currently. In Canada, we have a -1 growth rate. -1 in Canada, 5% booming in the United States. And I think that, yes, absolutely, the Biden plan is a huge factor in explaining that growth difference. But another aggregate demand effect is through the real estate and through the mortgage reorganization. So this to say, in conclusion, yeah, I think monetary policy is ineffective in trying to attain an inflation target. I think the transmission mechanism is all wrong. There's very little empirical. There's a theoretical support for it, and there's a faith support for it, but that's that's about it. But it does have an impact, nevertheless, and that impact can be felt through existing household debt. And Steve Keen has done a lot of simulations with household debt and increases in interest rates. And his model shows that how stable the systems are because of that. So, and Canadians are amongst the most indebted in the world. So we have huge household debt. And when that interest rate goes up, it does affect. And so we haven't had a soft landing in Canada. And I think one of the reasons is this one. I think that's it. That. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you, Sean, for your very interesting speech. Permit me to say that perhaps this speech is a proof that to discuss is very important, because I mean that after our workshop in Toronto now, there is a converging towards a very similar interpretation of several things, both on passivity rule and also on the mechanism of transmission of monetary policy. So I think that is very useful and important. I have only an observation, but it's very, I am sure that you agree with respect to the natural rate of interest. I think that is not only a problem, of course, of measure it or to find it or to estimate it. It is the fact that it doesn't exist. It is not determined by productivity and TRIF as in the new consensus model. So, if there are questions, no, Riccardo, yes.
Let me give the mic to Antonella to begin.
No, but mine is just a very simple observation about your thought about the necessity to fix a long-term, the interest rate that stays there, stabilizes, etc. And the issue seems to be whether it has to be a nominal interest rate or a real interest rate. And when you have inflation pushed by some exogenous factors, I think you cannot for a long time keep the interest rate, the real interest rate negative. So you have to take that into account.
Okay, so I have more of a suggestion. I don't know, but the last note with which you concluded the presentation, according to which the interest rate actually can have a negative effect on output through private debt, etc. I totally agree with that. I think it's a very persuasive story. Still, don't you feel that basically that opened the door for a sort of revival of a Phillips curve, Taylor rule story? So in periods of high inflation, you raise the interest rate. That slows down aggregate demand because of the channel you explained to us. That increases unemployment. That weakens the working class, leading to a slowdown in nominal wages. So even if the original sorts of inflation were others, still does kind of do the job of slowing down inflation, even if the distributive implications are unpleasant, etc., etc. I have another comment, a very brief one. So, I mean, I have the impression that even with fixed rate mortgages, there are issues for aggregate demand, only through a different channel. I mean, if you take together a mortgage with a fixed rate, basically you realize that you are going to have to pay a huge amount of money, so you're not going to buy a new apartment. So perhaps it's through a different channel of aggregate demand, basically curbing new residential investment, but still, even with fixed rate mortgages, you might have a negative impact on aggregate demand. Thank you.
Yes. You know, absolutely. You know, now imagine back in 2007 when there was no inflation to speak of. These questions didn't come up. But now it's a question that we've got to deal with, and especially since we saw inflation up to 10% in the United States. But my answer to that would be, is inflation is cost inflation more transitory than demand inflation? And if it is, you know, it's short-lived. Why about, you know what I mean? I think you understand what I mean. So I'm of the opinion that most inflation is cost related. If you see the inflation of 1980, it was temporary. And then, you know, at what, you know, if inflation hovers 3.5, comes back to 4, 3, are these variations in inflation that important that you need to, you know, change? A monetarist might say, yes, of course, we want zero inflation. But for post-Keynes, you know, lots of studies have shown that inflation in the single digits don't pose much problems. So, I mean, they might be uncomfortable for workers, and they might be, but then fiscal policy can come in and do something about that. So that would be my answer. Is inflation more transitory than permanent? And I don't see many cases of permanent inflation, or what they call of, you know, unanchored inflation expectations. So that would be my answer to that. To you, I would say, oh man, you know, I am okay with a Phillips type argument if it's argued out and there's a story involved. That's what I would say. I mean, but then you do get back to the idea that you're using, and I presume in your story, it creates unemployment somewhere. And so you're still using monetary policy to create unemployment, which is, for me, waging the war on workers. And, you know, you're essentially, and we've had central bankers in the United Kingdom telling workers, you better not demand high wage increases. And so you're basically, you know, we seem to be okay in a society when the private sector firms are making 25% profits. But if workers want to make 3% increase in wages, we find that absolutely horrible. And we have to fight that. I don't agree with that. And I think that, again, we could use inflation, I think, through caps or through some sort of, and we can think of a number of measures, fiscal measures, to bring inflation down. So you don't have to use that monetary policy. That's what I would say to that.
Okay, Antonio Faro.
Unionization rates have come down a lot. So the idea that workers don't have the power much, and I think that in itself accounts for the flattening of the Phillips curve. So yeah, absolutely disagree with what you say. I would still say there must be better ways of doing it.
Thank you, Louis-Philippe. Very interesting presentation. So some suggestions and questions, especially. The first one is about parking it approach, because following parking approach, as you suggest, it's very based on a real interest rate. Don't you think that heterodox economists can put more attention on nominal interest rate, also looking at the effects on residential market, mortgage sector or of the economy, because following parking it approach with high inflation rate, you can have high nominal interest rates. The second question is about that I understand that it's very important to have a monetary policy rule, to have a dialogue with mainstream economists, but it's very necessary to have a precise monetary policy rule, in your opinion, or it's okay also to maintain a more wide look, flexible look at the discretionary look. And the third one question is about Mark Lawa, because he criticized a lot Smith rule to not guarantee ability, because Smith rule could have a real interest rate equal to 0. So about the relationship between real interest level and financial stability, because I know that you have a different perspective compared to one of Mark. No, to last question about the okay. Yeah. Okay.
So
Okay, now, yes, okay.
So yeah, really, I think the real estate market is important. Absolutely. And I want to say about mortgages, Americans are affected in their mortgage payments for people taking on new mortgages. They're taking on new mortgages at a higher rate. So they are affected somewhat, but not as much as in the case of renewable mortgages. So yeah, you're right. Real estate, I think it's a very important, and we see the real estate market in Canada has completely collapsed. I think now construction of new homes is at the low is where it was back in 1995. So that's a huge collapse, and that has huge aggregate demand effects. Not only in terms of lost wages, but they're not buying windows and doors and toilets and bathtubs. That multiple that by 1 million. So you have a real demand effect, and you're right about that. The Smith rule, yeah. So the difference between the two is that John wants the elimination of the rentier class, which is what it does if you have the real interest rate at 0. Mark says in one of his articles, the rentier class is a necessary evil. So in order to keep social peace, you have to give them an increase in income at the same level as the increase in workers, and that maintains social peace. Randy, of course, goes further because Randy favors a nominal rate of 0. So you're talking about negative real rates. So he just wants to have a completely decrease. So John Smithin is that it freezes the distribution of income in that sense. Randy wants it, and that could, lead to social instability. I don't know. What was the third question?
flexible rule.
Yeah, so this is sort of the debate I'm currently having. I was just arguing with Mario last night. Mark replied at one point, but he didn't reply to that specific comment. But Mark agrees with me that you shouldn't overburden central banks with lots of stuff. Let fiscal policy do it. So there's an agreement there. But I think, Mario, I certainly want to have fixed nominal rule, and then, maybe adjust it if there are structural changes, not because of inflation, because inflation is probably more temporary. So why bother? But, and I think Mario is in favor of a fixed but flexible. I think that's what he's arguing for. But I think that we agree with 95%. We just have a little bit of disagreement over that. And I think that, by the way, the flexibility in the rule for Mario has nothing to do with inflation. It has to do with unemployment. So if unemployment goes up too high, it favors lowering the rule. My argument is, empirical studies show that
is not the Passanetti rule.
No, that's right. But that's what I'm saying. You're right about that. But we are sort of in a different. We're having all these questions now. But my argument against the flexible rule is lowering. We had interest rate of 0. It didn't really have an impact on output or investment. The real economy doesn't. And we know that. And there's lots of empirical evidence that shows that. So why? And if you have a permanent nominal percent, let's say, bringing it down to 2 or to 1.5, it's not going to have that much of an impact on unemployment. I don't think so. I think the real driver of unemployment is fiscal policy. So,
Maria Cristina.
Yeah, so my question is exactly about exchange rates. Yeah, well, I'm Brazilian, so in Latin America, it's a thing. So I don't think we can actually lose that degree of freedom in median low-income countries. And the next thing is, I agree with the comment of Ricardo on the new constructions. And, there's also the effect on rents of houses. Because if the price of houses goes down and there's less construction and people are less willing to buy their own house because it actually costs more, there are more people going on rents and rents go up. And mostly lower income households are the ones that have a rented house, and this also enters the CPI, so real wages go down. So basically, that's it.
Yeah. Story, and in fact, my last graph on mortgages, a lot of the rent increases. Right about your story. Another story is that those increases in mortgage were translated into higher rents as well. And, Statistics Canada has come out recently and said a third of the inflation is due to rents. And so I absolutely agree. So it's an extension of what I was, and I should have mentioned that, yes.
Okay, other question? Perhaps the last one. There are other questions from the floor? Okay. These are the last 2 questions.
Thank you. I would ask about the issue of monetary policy and fiscal policy. In my view, there are 2 phases of political economy, but we know that sometimes the central bank is not a part of government, but because it's independent. So what is your opinion about it, and also the effect on public debt? Because central bank is independent, and so there are some emphasis on central bank, etc. Thank you.
I have a question about, you were talking about how the Passanetti rule was to target the long-term interest rate, while the policy rate is actually a short-run interest rate. So I'd like to know which is the post-Keynesian explanation of this relation between the two rates, because something that was also puzzling in the last years was the inversion of the yield curve that is supposed to always predict a recession. This is related to the failure of monetary policy to affect output, or there is something going on also in the relation between short and long-term interest rates?
Thank you. Central bank independence, I think central banks are independent in theory, not in practice. Plenty of examples of that. Trichet in number. Okay. Yeah, and then the question is, the idea is that central bank independence is required because it better delivers on low inflation. But there's no empirical support for that. I know that people like Barry Aikengreen has some sort of table of the degrees of central bank independence, and a lot of scholars use that to regress those values on inflation and whatever. And they find that the higher the degree of central bank independence, the better performance. But, if you all have to sort of, how do you measure? You have to question the measurement of central bank independence in the Aiken-Green index. I'm not convinced that it's a particularly good index. And I'm not particularly, I don't particularly believe that the more independent a central bank, the better performance the economy. So that, and but the central bank independence again is a modern construct. Central banks many of them were created to finance government, debts during wartime. So I would question it in that way. You have another question? Yeah. So So that's why I would favor certainly a lower interest rate. Keynes tells us that the central bank can have any long-term rate of interest, and I believe that. I think that the central banks could have, just like they have a target short-run rate, could have a target long-run rate. And then like a 10-year rate, for example, and just intervene in the markets to keep that rate on target. I think post-Keynesians recognize that the short-term rate does influence longer-ish rates on various assets. But I think that the central bank, we saw it during COVID, the central bank massively intervened, lowered long-term rates like they wanted. So I think that the story is quite simple. But central banks may not want to control the longer rates. So I think that the yield curve is largely a construct that you let the markets decide, but you could easily intervene.
Okay, thank you to everyone. We are perfectly in time. The conference is closed. Thank you, Professor Rochon.